And good evening to everybody tonight. Thank you for joining me this evening on a topic that actually I could have broken down into multiple smaller topics just because of the extent of information or how deep in the weeds we would want to get. Good news, we won't be getting into the deep weeds, so we should be done in a half hour or less, as always, probably more like 20 minutes or less. But this can get a good little primer on this week's topic, sugar cravings and energy slumps, what your body is telling you. And if this is the first time you're joining one of these, my name's Laura Goldman. I am a registered dietitian, and I wanted to present this for you this week as part of the weekly webinars that I give. At the end, of course, there is a Q&A section where you can feel free to ask a question about this topic, or if there's another nutrition topic that comes to mind, you can reach out just by pressing that Q&A button at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And by all means, feel free to remain anonymous if you would prefer. Otherwise, if you leave your name, I will likely just say it out loud so that you're aware I'm addressing your question. But without further ado, let's get started. So let's remember, as I say almost every week, the quality of your calories matters. And it would be very evident in this particular topic, of course, because the simple sugars, the ones that we often crave sometimes, not necessarily the best quality, and we tend to return to them over and over again, or more often than we ought to, simply because they might be delicious, but not necessarily the highest of qualities. So picking a higher quality calories generally going to help with some of these cravings as well. So what we're going to cover again briefly, going on an overview of what causes sugar cravings, some of the main reasons that are out there, as well as energy slumps. A lot of times they tie together, but I have two separate slides just to touch on them individually. I'll also mention how GLP-1 medications may or may not affect these types of cravings or energy slumps. And is there anything that our bodies are actually telling us by dealing with these cravings and energy slumps going on throughout the day or days? Maybe there's a few answers there, something we can look into. And I also have a few tips on how to maybe stabilize your energy, reduce cravings, and hopefully feel better, more energetic throughout the day. So what causes sugar cravings? There could be a variety of reasons. And so one of the first ones, and one of the very basic ones, is if your blood sugars are going down, that means that your body may need more energy to function, to go into cells and to do and be active. So it can cue the brain by saying, let's eat. My blood sugars are a bit low. We need to eat to replenish that so we are able to go about our day. I'll mention, of course, the reason why we may be cued with this, even if we feel like we're carrying on some extra pounds, is because sugars or carbs are the most easily utilized by our bodies. So it's quick energy, it's efficient to be used, whereas fat tissue takes a bit more time to break down, and it takes a little more effort on the body's part. So the body wants to do what's simple and easy. And that's one way that they go about that. Sorry about my cat interrupting. Also, stress. So stress may not directly be nutrition related, of course, but stress does inspire the production of cortisol, and cortisol seems to inspire hunger. And I'm sure you've heard about stress eating, or some people like to say eating my feelings, or searching out comfort foods. And it can be due to the production of cortisol. I will mention that it's usually cortisol production tends to be higher. We'll see it in sort of people who have long-term ongoing stress. Usually acute or sudden bouts of stress, they don't exactly inspire hunger. Those tend to be where people don't feel hungry at all. But it does depend on the person. Also, need for sleep. And this might be one of the more frustrating reasons that we may crave sugar, because I think many of us feel as though we could use a few extra hours, or that we're not getting enough restful sleep at night. And unfortunately, that does interfere with our appetite and what we choose to eat. Our hunger hormones can be affected by a lack of sleep. There's a hormone produced by our body called ghrelin, and that is the technical term is orexigenic. So orexigenic means appetite stimulating, appetite creating. So the ghrelin seems to increase if we need a little more sleep. And also, the lack of sleep impacts food choices. And this could be for a variety of reasons. One, lack of sleep seems to decrease our inhibitions and let us choose whatever we want to eat, whatever sounds good at the moment, without really pausing to think about it. But also, imagine that you're done with a very long day of work, or you've just had a long day, you're tired and exhausted. What are we going to do when it's time for dinner? Are we going to go into the kitchen and prepare a big meal or cook? It's usually the last thing that anybody wants to think about doing at that point in time, and it's completely understandable. I've been there. It's not easy to feel inspired when you're so tired. Rhyme somewhat intended. So just remember that as well. And then finally, and the reason why I have this image here on this slide, even though I'm not a neurologist by any means, so I'm not going to go into super detailed discussion of the brain, but sugar does seem to reinforce that reward-seeking behavior, that feel-good behavior. And here's where people may talk about sugar addiction, sugar being addictive, etc. If you look that up, people will debate it back and forth. It doesn't get the same designation of addictive as, say, nicotine or alcohol. However, you can see that it does seem to inspire some reward responses. People tend to seek it out. And there's that, what I tell people is, if they have a first bite of a cookie, we're already thinking, I want the next bite. It doesn't seem to be enough just to stop at one bite or anything like that. And if you can go cold turkey on sugar for a while, those desires, those cravings for eating more sugar seems to decrease over time. So there does seem to be some attributes to sugar that make it seem quite addictive, and many people will swear they are, and I can understand. And there does seem to be an aspect to that. So let's just remember, yes, it does inspire something in our brain. There's something called the hedonic pathway, and there's also the homeostatic pathway. I'll mention this as well as a little aside here. So the homeostatic pathway is a pathway in our brain that communicates we need to eat to live, to sustain ourselves. Whereas the hedonic pathway, just like the word would suggest, hedonism, the hedonic pathway is saying, this tastes good, I want it, I like it, I need more. And so oftentimes the hedonic pathway tends to win over and overtake the homeostatic pathway, which is why even if you're full or satisfied, that extra dessert at the end might sound appealing. Now, what about energy slumps? Do these tie together? Well, you can see I do have this blood sugar roller coaster image here on this slide because they do tie in a little bit. So I cannot remember the exact percentage, but there's a very high percentage of people, when surveyed, will report that they get this 3 p.m. energy slump. So after lunchtime, say you're at work or something, you have lunch, and then you go home or you go back to the office, and right around 3, you hit this wall of, I don't want to do any more work. I'm exhausted. I would like to take a nap. And there are some reasons behind this. So there are some people who may have what's called reactive hypoglycemia. So that's when there's almost a little bit too much insulin in the body, or it seems to, whatever insulin you have seems to decrease your blood sugars quite a bit more than what other people might be dealing with. So you can see that roller coaster sudden drop can sometimes happen for people. But also, many of us have these natural, actually all of us have these blood sugar waves that go through our body. And I talk to people about how we really want our blood sugar waves to be more like this green line on the image here versus the red line, because when we have these drastic waves where we have these valleys and these peaks, the valleys will make us crave more sugar, but also usually feel a bit sluggish and tired. So if you have a high carb lunch, chances are you're going to be feeling that slump a little bit more strongly. And speaking of the high carb lunch, part of what I mean by that, because carbs are somewhat, I don't want to say inevitable because there are people who do low carb, but they're very much a reality in our lives. Not many of us want to give up bread or even fruit or carb containing foods. But if we're eating that on its own and we don't have that balance of maybe some protein or fiber, then that lack of balance actually can cause those blood sugars to rise a bit faster and fall a bit harder. The protein and the fiber and fat to a degree as well slows down that absorption of carbohydrates and also prevents those big crashes. So I encourage people to really seek out a good protein source and not necessarily a high pasta with the breadstick type of meal, because focusing a little more on protein, non-starchy veggies, you probably won't have that energy crash quite as harshly, if at all. Another energy slump is long periods without food. That can also cause blood sugars to decrease. Many people start out their mornings with a lower blood sugar simply because they haven't had much to eat. There are some people who start out with a higher blood sugar. It does depend on our biology, but when you go long periods of time, your blood sugars tend to decrease. And anybody who's tried to go keto will tell you the first few days can sometimes be really rough because they're dealing with these lower blood sugars and really struggling to get past that initially. Some other areas that can cause energy slumps, and one that we don't give enough credit to, I don't think, is dehydration. So many of us underhydrate, if you will, and we don't drink enough water, get enough fluids throughout the day. I'm sure you've heard fluids be reinforced with you at Premier Weight Loss. And not only is that good for overall health, gut health, and general body function, but dehydration can lead to sleepiness as well. And finally, as we've said already once before, poor sleep. This might go without saying. If you haven't slept well, chances are you're not going to really feel like your best, most energetic self the next day. So how do GLP-1 medications affect these cravings? Well, you may be aware that many people do report a decrease in cravings. Some people talk about that food noise being turned off, and that's such wonderful news to hear, especially if that's been a problem. But not everybody is able to say that the cravings completely stop, or maybe they crave something different. That also can happen. But not everyone reports that decrease in craving, and it can be dependent on, again, many, many factors. Perhaps, okay, you're taking the GLP-1, but stress is still a factor in your life. You're still very busy. And so this can still influence your decisions. You may still seek that comfort foods provided because they made you feel good before. Yes, you're not having that other type of craving quite as strongly, but that stress is influencing you. So maybe if that were removed, you might not be as inspired to eat sort of those comforting foods. Also, even if you're eating smaller amounts, and this is where I talk about the quality of your calories matters, if your food choices are lower in quality, so we're talking refined or simple carbohydrates, you will still have more sugar spikes and falls. The dose might be smaller, but it can still have an impact on you. And again, as always, and if you've been with me before when we've talked about protein or fluids, those are still key. So you do want to focus on those since they're going to be helpful for your overall health, but also helpful to prevent blood sugar spikes and falls, et cetera, et cetera. So what's my body saying? Well, this is the part where it can depend. So sometimes we have to be very introspective and check within ourselves about this. Just because I'm craving sugar. It doesn't mean I need simple sugar. So be aware of that. There are people who have said aloud, well, I'm eating these gummy bears because I've craved them, but I think because I'm craving them, that means my body needs whatever in them. And I can promise you this, there's nothing in a candy or a gummy bear that your body needs that it couldn't get from, say, fruit or vegetables or something of the like. But perhaps you need calories. And especially when people have cut calories drastically and are working to lose weight, sometimes there is this increased hunger, increased appetite. If you've ever tried to lose weight without these medications that can help suppress appetite, thankfully, I'm sure you've noticed that when cutting calories, even if you're cutting by not a whole lot, you will notice this drastic increase in maybe cravings or feeling like you're super hungry. And that is completely normal. That's tracked. Many people report that commonly. And again, that has a lot to do with hunger hormones and what's going on. So you may not be literally starving, but your body is still saying, I'm not getting the calories I used to. What's going on? Somebody needs to feed me. On the flip side, there are some people who over restrict, and maybe there are some cravings just because, no, we do need calories, we need to function. So again, make sure you're checking in with yourself. Am I over restricting? Or am I getting used to a new way of eating? Also, I'm thirsty. I'm sure you've heard the trick of, drinking a glass of water before eating, one that can help people fill up. But also, if you're drinking throughout the day, not necessarily a whole glass at once, but that can also help cut down on those types of cravings. Frequently, as we age, especially, our perception of thirst seems to weaken as we age, unfortunately. And then we seem to misunderstand thirst for hunger. And frequently, we will reach for the easy snacks when we're actually really just needing a drink. So be aware of that. And also, and this is where mindful eating and mindful approaches to food can take place, your body might just be bored. I know when I was younger, if I was bored or didn't really think of anything I wanted to do or had to do, well, the first place I stopped was the kitchen. What sounds good? What would be fun to eat? Maybe I will make something. Or when I would try to avoid studying for finals in college, I was normally in the kitchen baking cookies because I would justify it as, well, it has to do somewhat with what my future career will be. But that is one way that we will approach boredom. Also, I'm stressed. We've already talked about that, but the response to stress can frequently be, I need something to feel better. I need to eat something, and that's also a factor there. And so if you're feeling hungry, if you're having these I'm bored, I'm stressed, especially possibilities in the back of your brain, to gauge real hunger, ask yourself, would I eat a food I don't normally eat? And what I mean by that is more, would I eat something that's boring? So, for example, to me, I think apples are kind of boring as a fruit. They're not very interesting. They're not something I seek out actively. So, if I ask myself, would I eat an apple right now? And if the answer is yes, then that probably means I'm hungry. And so that is a decent way to sort of check in with yourself saying, am I just raiding the pantry because I want something, because it sounds just appealing, or am I coming to the pantry because I actually need to feed myself? So I think that is a really good technique to be able to check in with yourself and see what your body's really saying. So let's talk about reducing cravings. This is an image very similar to the one that I had in a couple slides earlier, talking about different glycemic indexes and glycemic loads. And one way that you can affect the glycemic index of your foods is by finding balance in your meals and snacks. So if you have something with carbohydrates, we can even use that apple as an example. Apples aren't super, super high, but they will bring your blood sugars up. So let's look and see, can we add some protein to that? Say some peanut butter or a piece of cheese, or maybe some even cashews, almonds, something like that, or a little low sodium protein beef stick. That's one way to sort of add that to your snack. Or fat, which I do mean healthy fats, of course. So you might find that in the peanut butter, or you'd find that in, say, guacamole or the olive oil and hummus. And then fiber. There is some fiber that comes with the apple. You can also find fiber in really any non-starchy vegetable and most fruits. But while you don't have to add all of those together, make sure that the carbs are with something else, because that will help stabilize your glucose and make these more smooth hills versus these mountains that you'd have to deal with. Secondly, make sleep a priority. I know some people get sleep studies in case they might need a CPAP. I'm not necessarily promoting that. You know your body better than I do. But if you're not getting enough sleep, it really is a priority. It's much higher priority than many of us give credit to. So take care of yourself. If you're taking one of these medications, you're working on being healthier anyway, and this is another way to be healthy. So make sleep a priority. And third, get moving. And I'm not saying you have to go run a marathon or anything like that, but sometimes when the kitchen or the snack is within an arm's reach, or maybe just a little up and go, sometimes if you can just go for a walk, remove yourself from the temptation. You go out in nature, and now that it's warmer, that's much easier. But going for a walk not only takes you away from that temptation, keeps you occupied, but it can also be the stress reliever, since we've been talking about stress being a factor in cravings as well. And it's always harder to get started than to keep going. And so it may not sound particularly appealing on its face, but try it slowly but surely, or try something that will keep you occupied. I know some people use those coloring books or something to work on, maybe a jigsaw puzzle. So it might not be as mobile, but it's something to keep you occupied and away from the simple snacks. And then a tip that I've used with a few people with good results is choose sugar-free gum in between your meals. Sugar-free gum, especially the minty flavor, tends to reduce, I don't want to necessarily say reduce appetite, but does have a little bit of a tempering effect. And when you're chewing that, you're occupying your mouth and you're not really thinking about, oh, what else can I eat? And so that can also be a very simple solution there. And some people wonder about the sugar-free aspect, since artificial sweeteners can be a concern. But I would say in the grand scheme of things, if it's chewing sugar-free gum and that keeps you from making choices that might not be the healthiest, I would say that's a better pathway to follow than not chewing sugar-free gum and falling into those older habits. Now, I mentioned earlier about mindful eating, and this might also be a way to check in with yourself. And this is the mindful eating scale, sort of an appetite scale that you can use if you feel like doing a screenshot, or I'm always happy to share it with you afterwards. If you reach out to the Premier Weight Loss staff, they can get you in touch with me, and I'd be happy to send you any information you want. And this type of scale, there are many different types, but this shows you sort of a way to rank yourself. So, for example, normally you want to be somewhere between 4 and 6. And so if you're eating and you pause for a moment and you feel like you're at a 5, wait 10 or 15 minutes, because you may end up, even without eating, going up to the 6. And that's a place that you definitely should stop, somewhere between a 5 and a 6. Also, this is the time where you would want to go shopping for food if you're at the grocery store. Being at a 5, 6, or of course above, although you might not want to move around at these levels, usually keeps you from buying those impulse purchases. Whereas if you were shopping and you were around a 2 or a 3, chances are you will buy almost anything and everything that looks good, or anything that's on those end caps that's on special and might be new or appealing. Something else that you can use, though, not just about grocery shopping, but if you're checking in with yourself and the apple technique, would I eat something boring, doesn't really work, You can also think about, all right, am I at a 2 or a 3? Clearly a 1, that would be very obvious. Starving, weak, dizzy. Yes, definitely you need to eat. At a 2 or a 3, so maybe the irritable, low energy, stomach growling, feeling those cues, check in and ask yourself, am I feeling this before I'm about to eat? Or am I always somewhere around barely a 4 out of 5 when I'm moving into another meal? Because allowing yourself to feel a little bit hungry is also a good indicator that it's time to eat and you haven't overeaten, or you're not just eating to not, eating to fill up the day and not feel that hunger. Now, the other thing I talked about pausing when you're feeling about a 5 is just because if you keep eating till you're starting to feel almost overly full, then beyond that, you might get beyond comfortable. And most of us don't ever want to reach this level. It's easy to do, especially if we feel super hungry or if we're having cravings. But I just wanted to show you the scale to see where you could rank yourself in between meals or around mealtime. So putting it together, cravings and energy slumps happen to nearly all of us. I saw some reports say about 80%, others around 50%, but that's quite a bit. And it is a signal to us. It's not a defect in who we are. But it's very important to focus on balanced nutrition, focus on getting in enough hydration, and of course, stress management and restful sleep. Be aware that when you're on GLP-1 medications, it's extra important to tune in with your body and approach your nutrition intentionally and think about, how is this going to best serve me and reach my goals? And don't get me wrong, everybody wants to enjoy their birthday cake, and that's okay. But in general, on average, 6 days a week or 7.5 days a week, make sure that you're approaching that nutrition with intent. And remember, cravings can be managed with various techniques. It just depends on which one works for you. And if you have other techniques that you've tried and been successful with, by all means, feel free to share. I know it's not a question, but I'm always happy to hear. And with that, we are on to questions. Does anybody have any questions that come to mind? If there are, by all means, feel free to, again, hit that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'll leave this open for just a couple minutes in case anyone does have questions. And you can be anonymous or have your name. And we did go almost 30 minutes, which I didn't expect, but I hope you found this informative and helpful. And now I'll just be silent and see if any questions come in for a little bit here. Again, I am sorry about my cat. He is also having some cravings because he definitely has been fed his dinner already. Okay, it's been a couple of minutes. I'll leave it open for 1 minute more. I haven't seen any questions come in, which is fine. And he's much more vocal than I expected this evening. So I'll leave this open for 1 minute more. And of course, if you have questions that come to mind later, or you would rather them not be asked in a public forum, by all means, feel free to contact the staff at Premier Weight Loss. They will happily get in touch with me, and I would be more than happy to address your question offline, if you will. So feel free to work that way as well. Okay, well, it is 7:31, so I will let all of you get back to your evenings, but thank you again for joining me this evening. Again, if you do have questions that you would like to have answered later, by all means, get in touch with the Premier Weight Loss staff. But otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful, enjoyable evening and have a great dinner. Bye.